Naturally, given the magnitude of what the so-called counterculture has pulled, it's very natural that they don't particularly want to be understood carefully, and they don't want to have addressed what they've done and how they've done it. So, equally naturally, given the magnitude, the power and wealth behind what they did, they're trying to play a game of pin the tail on the donkey with a traumatized, deaf, brain damaged child who they held hostage in a private concentration camp scenario in Highland Park of Pittsburgh. But when you pay attention to details, you can see the formidable situation that Jimmy Crary was up against. I speak for him as myself because nobody else seems willing to. A good example of this is what happened today, January 31st, 2026, in Gaza. I'll tell you what happened and then I'll explain what I mean by how this is an example of what Jimmy Crary has been up against. What happened is that the Zios, the Zionists, the psychopaths, the Israelis, the community supporting them, the so-called second phase of the Gaza ceasefire, the so-called Board of Peace, announced that they were going to open the Rafah gates. And how did they do this gesture? They did perform this gesture by the largest tent city bombing since the ceasefire began. So far, they've killed reportedly about 50 people. Another massacre in a horrendous ordeal for everyone on earth, witnessing the destruction of women and children, and of course, our peers. What is the meaning of this? It's in the understanding that they're looking for people to search for meaning. They have books called Man's Search for Meaning. It shows you that a deaf child who was largely prelingual, in whom torture was not in his vocabulary, abuse was not in a Pittsburgh public school children's vocabulary in those days, would be up against the postdoctoral symposium of the Council of Rabbinical Esoteric Connivers, who put together this megalomaniacal scenario with its terrible Texas school book script from the insane asylum of Hitler Reagan. Opening the Rafah gates is a pun, and it's meant to evoke Country Joe and the Fish at Woodstock. We say, open up the pearly gates, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all going to die. Now that might sound like an ad-libbed quip of a stand-up dark gallows comedian, but it's not. It's written into the blood and thunder of this Nazi nightmare. When I was kidnapped and tortured as a child, I was taken to a place called King's Estate in a tower. If you look up King's Estate, it's the gaudiest mansion in an area of the city known for gaudiest mansions. In fact, it's probably the gaudiest mansion in all of Pennsylvania. In other words, It's Trump Central. Across the street from the girls who put together the situation in which I was mailed the letters from Israel, which we now know was the Texas school book. King's estate is meant to evoke King's heavenly estate, like the Rafa Gates, like the Sobibor fiddlers on the roof of the concentration camp. How do we know this? From a 9-hour film by Claude Lanzmann called Shoah, about the Jewish ordeal in the era of Nazi Germany. There it is revealed by a concentration camp guard that the ramp leading to the gas chambers was called by the Germans Himmelsweg, which means the road to heaven. King's heavenly estate. They murdered Martin Luther King over the symbolic, scripted, chivalric code to imply that they were protecting virginity. We now know, of course, that they were protecting the virgins so that they could be used by cannibals on Epstein Island. But to the Republican Congress and the House of Representatives, to all the Democratic Party, that is beside the point. When you look at the men who kidnapped and tortured me and Seattle's role in bringing to conclusion the subordination of Jimmy Carrey to the script, the masterpiece of hate crime upon hate crime. You see, a day when I was out, unable to go to school, freezing in the cold, because my memory had been welded shut with a neurobehavioral chemical designed by Spectra Laboratory forensic coroner named Cyril Weck to help Bernard Watmaker, an Attica State Prison psychiatrist who was living next door to me, both Zionists. I couldn't remember what it was that was throttling in the abyss that had fused shut, such that Dr. Michael Soso of neurology at the University of Pittsburgh actually took notes when I described it as a neuroplastic amnesia phenomenon, a medical mystery. Seattle and Pittsburgh and Peter Gabriel digging in the dirt to make fun of the situation that I found myself in, to make it harder for Jimmy Carrey to escape, implied that I was hiding a defiant trespass, or DT, implying that I was a date rapist over a letter to Leslie Katz, which I had upbraided her for mocking me, that I respected her virginity. In other words, Seattle contributed to this by castrating me for refusing to be a date rapist. And what I remembered when I lapsed into seizures was being found that day, that freezing cold day when I was in junior high, by stolen car thieves named Pitmen, who forced me into the automobile and gassed me with paint thinner, just as they had in the castle tower at King's Estate. This was not, as is custom in Pittsburgh to say, having fun. The mayor of Pittsburgh, God bless Mayor Peduto, apologized to me years later after they caught John Schulman, about whom I had submitted a report. He was involved in museum theft. I suspected he had defrauded the post office. None of this matters to the people who choose to overlook the meaning of pitmen. I have a book here from 2018, a revision of the history of Nuremberg, in which the concentration camp survivors know perfectly well and state what pitmen are. They're the people who dig the pits for the corpses in the concentration camps. It's like Hitman, Pit of Hell, Pitbull. These were ferocious people from Pittsburgh. But it's also like Quarrymen, the original name of the Beatles. When Nosferatu opened up the Ralphie gates and then bombed tents, he was being despicable in the same way that he gassed me in King's Heavenly Estate. He was selling the ramps to the gas chambers as Himmelschweg. Please stop